So I just showed you how to photograph your two-dimensional works on paper or canvas, whatever you're working with that's somewhat flat. Smaller sizes in particular, 11 by 16. Next, I'm going to show you how to do more of a controlled lighting setup, but also on a vertical wall. This setup works really well if you have larger pieces and you also just want a little bit more control over your photograph. Or maybe you don't have access to natural window light. There's many ways to do it, and this is just something that's a little bit more accessible to people, but keep in mind, use whatever works for you. The point is that you're documenting your work as accurately as you can, just so you can submit your work and archive it. So, couple things. I have a little bit more of a robust tripod. It's a little taller, a little sturdier. It's also has a screw attachment, so I can attach different camera bases and things, or camera bodies. You just need a camera that gives you control over the exposure, lets you control white balance, and also gives you large enough files that you can actually see detail in it. So some basic point and shoot cameras that don't even have lenses attachments, those work great too. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so you've got your camera, you've got some lights. Talk about the lights in a second, but I've also just repurposed some of the foam core that we were using for the natural lighting setup. Just wired the back so I could hang it. You don't have to wire it. You could museum putty, whatever works for you, just something to get it on the wall. And I've also used some earth magnets. Make sure they're clean. Magnets tend to want to attract dirt and things to it, and you don't want to get it onto your print. And just place them on the margins. You can place them on the top edge, especially if you're only planning to crop in to the print image itself rather than the entirety of the paper. But I tend to put them right in the center, kind of like that, because it's easier to Photoshop out these little circles when they're inside the interior of the paper rather than covering up part of the decollage. I only needed 2 for this particular print. This is just BFK white. But if you have something that's a little bit more curly, or it just catches a breeze a little bit more, like the Kitakata Natural, for example, it tends to want to curl on the edges. In that case, you might want 4. So. I've also put it drastically lower than eye level. This is just so that I can have my whole setup be somewhat parallel. So you notice the lights are pretty much on the same plane as the camera. They're about center-ish to the print. The idea being that you want everything to be on the same playing field, so that way you can actually get accurate light casting, just like we were doing with the natural light, and having it be somewhat parallel. Okay, so that looks somewhat level. Lights, so these are just basic little light clamps. You can just squeeze and retract. I've just put them onto chairs because that's what I have. You can use light stands. You can be a little bit, if you want to invest a little bit more, you can purchase light boxes or soft boxes, depending. You don't need it though. Having these little metal reflectors helps spread the light out just enough. If you need diffusion of the light a little bit more intensely for larger prints, that might be a little bit more necessary. In that case, you might want to purchase a softbox that has 4 slots for putting lights into, and sort of a covering that diffuses the light, and you would need 2. When I shoot photos for Davidson galleries, that's what I use. So the light bulb that I have, this is a CFL bulb. It has a color temperature of 5,500 kelvins. So basically as close to daylight as I can get. Between 5,000 and 5,500 is pretty ideal. If you're buying these, double check that they have a CRI, color rendering index, of at least 90. If you're investing in purchasing something like this, you might as well try to get the best one. And even something that's a higher CRI is still going to be only around like $6 a bulb, so keep that in mind. So CFL, one thing to note, these do contain mercury. They're not incredibly environmentally friendly. You do need to dispose of them at hazardous waste sites. They last a really long time, but if you're looking for something a little bit more environmentally friendly, you might try to source a 55 or 5000 K LED light bulb. The other kind of bulb I have here to show you is just the halogen bulb. Halogens are fine. They're heavy though, and they tend to put out a lot of heat, and so they tend to be a little bit more hazardous to use, so I tend to stay away from these guys. Really be careful when you're purchasing lights of that color temperature reading. I think that's the biggest thing to kind of look out for, because if you have a yellow light, you're going to cast yellow onto your print, and that's going to change and misrepresent the colors that are actually present. So work with that as best as you can. As far as the placement of everything goes, I've already mentioned having the lights be parallel to the camera, not too far behind, not too far back to get started. Just put it right in that same line. And then the other thing to look for is the distance between the camera and the print. You want to sort of, I move the camera around a little bit just to show you kind of the camera itself. But when you're looking, this is not the viewfinder, but when you're actually looking at your print and whatnot, you want to make sure you've got it sort of oriented a little bit. You'll fine tune this, but you want to get it sort of oriented to the print itself so that you have a little bit of margin showing around the outside. That way you can kind of get the most detail as possible without having too much excess in the outside margins. So once that's kind of somewhat figured out, then you figure out your lighting. So these lights are set up about double this distance away from the camera. So don't measure it, don't worry about that too much. It's just a way to kind of orient yourself. So this is about a foot. This is about 2 feet. This is also about 2 feet, give or take. You're gonna move these about and find the best position. Anyways, you're gonna wanna set your ISO to around 100 or 200, however your camera settings are. You might have to dig a little bit in your menu and things. You also want to set your shutter speed to at least a 30th of a second. If you're using, even if with a tripod, you want it at least that. I would start at around 100th of a second. You also want to have your f-stop, and you'll find what works best for you, but the f-stop you do want to have somewhat around 8. You can kind of stop up or stop down depending on what the exposure needs, but that's a good place to start if you've never done it before. Let's see. Make sure your images that you're taking are set to, most camera settings allow you to set for RAW or large. If it's set to RAW, it automatically goes to largest size, but set it to one of those two to make sure you're picking up as much detail as possible.